Takere mai te ata, ka au, ka awatea, te hei Māoriora. Tātou katoa nā iwi o Aotearoa, tēnā koutou. Tēnā tātou whakarenuia ana te wiki nei, te wiki o te reo Māori. Greetings to you all from Otipoti, Dunedin. This week is the Māori Language Week, and the theme again this year is Kia kaha te reo Māori, or let the language live. Ki te ako tono au e te reo Māori. I'm still learning te reo Māori, if that hasn't already been obvious to those who speak the language. But this week and every week, I encourage everyone to try and use te reo Māori. This is a chance to celebrate and use our country's Indigenous language. Kia kaha te reo Māori. Cabinet met virtually today to review our progress on stamping out Covid-19 and to decide on the next steps for our alert levels in Auckland and for the rest of New Zealand. First, though, I'll begin with a brief update on the Auckland cluster. It has now been 2 weeks, one transmission cycle of the virus, since Auckland moved to what we have been calling 2.5. In that time, we have identified a further 36 cases in the community. All are associated with the wider Auckland cluster, and most were people who had a known link to the cluster and so were already isolated. Since Auckland moved out of level 3 restrictions 2 weeks ago, widespread testing that is roughly double what it was at level 1 has occurred. Over 100,000 tests have taken place nationwide that have not shown up any spread of the virus to date in other parts of New Zealand, despite the resumption of inter-regional travel. However, within the Auckland cluster is a potential trouble spot. The new subcluster that emerged in the past 2 weeks related to a bereavement associated with Mount Roskill Evangelical Church. This has led to 15 cases, and while there is no evidence of significant spread outside of the Auckland cluster, this event does raise the possibility that more people have been exposed within what is already our biggest cluster to date. The last time Cabinet made a decision to move down from level 2 to level 1, we had spent 26 days at level 2, more than 2 transmission cycles, and had gone 17 days without any new cases of COVID-19 in the country. That was to give ourselves confidence that any move back to level 1 would stick. So far, we have spent 14 days at what we are calling 2.5 in Auckland, and have had cases in the community continue to emerge every day, bar one. While no new community cases is not a measure in and of itself for moving down levels, as we know more cases will emerge from this cluster's tail, these cases can still continue to pose risks. New Zealand has followed a plan that has worked. Since the start, we have been cautious. This has both saved lives, but also meant our economy has been able to be more open in a more sustained way than nearly any other country in the world. It is a formula that works. So while our aim is to speedily move down alert levels safely, we also need to be focused on the future, on getting back to level 1, but in a sustained way and not rushing there, only having to bounce out of it soon after. Advice put to us today suggests we should be cautious about moving to level 1 immediately, and that it would be prudent to continue to monitor case numbers for a short while longer. That's why, on the advice of the Director General, Cabinet has decided on a short extension to the current restrictions of alert level 2.5 for Auckland and level 2 for the rest of the country. But I do want to signal what the likely next decisions are. For Auckland, Cabinet will review the current level 2.5 settings at our meeting on Monday, the 21st of September, with a view to increase gathering limits for Auckland if we are in a similar position with containing the cluster. If that change was agreed, this would then come into effect from Wednesday, the 23rd of September. That gives us time to rewrite the orders and gazette them. For the rest of the country, while we retain the status quo for now, Cabinet has agreed in principle that 11:59 p.m. on Monday, the 21st of September, the rest of New Zealand will move to Alert Level 1. This is contingent on cases tracking as they are and maintaining the containment we have seen. The move will be confirmed on Monday when Cabinet meets again. I know some of you may have questions as to why the rest of the country hasn't moved to Level 1 just yet and why we're making an in-principle decision to leave that move for another week. Modelling done for the Ministry of Health continues to suggest around a 25% chance of cases moving outside of the Auckland region. So while the cases are currently contained in Auckland, with interregional travel open, there does remain a risk of spreading the virus to the rest of the country. As I said, we haven't had many days without new cases appearing in Auckland, and it only requires one person travelling and attending a super spreader event somewhere else in the country, and we could be looking at further restrictions elsewhere. So the Level 2 precautions we have in place continue to act as a safety barrier for flare-ups in the rest of New Zealand. On the issue of travel, I can also announce today a change of physical distancing restrictions on planes and public transport. As a result of the extra measures we have in place at Level 2 in Auckland, and in particular the good uptake and compliance of our requirement that people wear a mask on public transport, today I confirm that we will ease physical distancing requirements on planes and public transport. So from today, public transport operators, including airlines, buses and trains, do not need to maintain any seating restrictions or passenger capacity limits at Level 2. Mask use will continue to be compulsory and has been key in the recommendation by the Director-General that this change is safe to occur. I know this change will make a real difference to Air New Zealand and those parts of the country seeking increased numbers of visitors, and the change may demonstrate the willingness of the government's behalf to constantly review our settings with everyone's health at the top of our minds. On opening up our economy, new data points to good increases in economic activity since the start of Level 2.5 in Auckland. Payment and traffic data in Treasury's latest weekly economic update showed economic activity across the Auckland region and the country bounced back to levels experienced under Alert Level 1 following Auckland's move out of Level 3. This shows that as a country we've got better at adapting to shopping local and logistics and keeping our economy moving, ultimately outperforming countries that decided against an elimination strategy. It's further proof that the plan works and that the best approach to a healthy economy is still getting the virus under control. This is a global pandemic, and the global economic outlook is weak, but continuing our elimination strategy based on strong and well-targeted public health measures allows economic activity in New Zealand to resume sooner than would otherwise be the case, and sooner than many other countries around the world. The counter of this is also true, and that late restrictions or those lifted too early have allowed the exponential spread of the virus and led to more severe lockdowns that restrict economic activity longer. So our plan is working, but it needs just a little bit more time. Like last time when we moved from Level 2 to Level 1 with caution, we experienced a strong bounce back in economic activity, which is what we're seeking again, protecting our current gains, expanding on them, and keeping people safe from the virus remains the best long-term strategy for our country. As we see major second waves globally, ours has been relatively small and contained. The guidelines everyone has followed has kept us safe. It's saved lives and helped get the economy moving quickly. We played the short game well because we had our eye on the future, on our lives back at Level 1, and making the most of the global opportunities that would create. We now need to keep our eyes on that prize and take actions to match that so we can get to Level 1 again, and we will. Happy now to take questions. Yep, that's correct. Oh, it's we did have a majority decision in Cabinet, but it's not unusual that from time to time New Zealand First may take a different view. They have in this case. They also took a different view on the timing of the Cook Islands bubble, on wanting to open up to Australia, and the lifting of restrictions in the past. So that's not unusual.
Are you concerned that this decision could lose you votes in this election?
These decisions have to be based on public health. They have to be based on the best way for us to get our economy in the long term back up and running again while keeping everyone safe. And that's the basis on which we are making these decisions. We've never put politics in it, and that's as it should
Are
be.
you concerned that this fatigue across the rest of the country, where we haven't seen any cases outside of Auckland?
I disagree. Look, my view is that we need to keep all of New Zealand safe. Modelling does suggest there is still a risk that cases could travel out of Auckland, that a bit of extra time gives us extra security against that. And I want to make sure that we're keeping all of New Zealand well, while at the same time signalling that we will, all being equal, all staying on track, lift those restrictions in a week.
You don't normally sort of give us all heads up about what you're planning to do right next Monday in terms of moving the rest of the country down to level 1. What is it that you're seeing in Rossville or in Auckland at the moment that sort of makes you want to take that extra week?
Well, actually, you will have seen that we have, in this more recent cluster we did a bit of signalling with the last shift as well. In part, it's just to give that sense of certainty, to give a sense of the direction of travel. And essentially, if we see things continuing to track as they are, that gives us the confidence that in a week's time, we will be ready to lift some of those restrictions in the rest of the country. And it helps people to plan around that.
Can you confirm how the person who visited Les Mills gym is linked to the Auckland cluster and why they were self-isolated?
Yes, I can. So that individual works in a managed isolation facility, and in the managed isolation facility that we have been keeping people who from the Auckland cluster have Covid-19. And so essentially, as a health worker that's being exposed to those who have been in quarantine, rather than having picked it up in the community. So that's the link. Again, with our workforce, we undertake regular testing there. That's how we've picked up this case. The individual's close contacts and their close contacts are being tested and have been tested, and so that gives us good confidence that that's well maintained and being well managed.
Can you clarify the rules on gym users at level 2.5 in Auckland, and do those need tightened?
Well, of course, we do have restrictions around group gatherings, and as I understand from what's been conveyed to me, we've got good compliance from our gyms who are operating under different settings, and of course they're used to now, having operated at these different alert level settings, making sure they're keeping their users safe. Of course, Auckland Regional Public Health have gone in there, identified any potential close contacts, and are doing all the work you'd expect to make sure that any outside issues around contact are being well tracked and well maintained.
Do you think the Health Ministry needs to provide advice to health workers like the nurse who tested positive about what activities are best to avoid outside of?
Well, of course, what we need to make sure is that people are tracking any symptoms, making sure that if they have any symptoms that they are staying home, as we ask anyone else. We also do ask them to take in particular care around even the clothing that they're changing in and out of once they return to their home. They are required to keep a very close and rigorous log of where they are travelling and who they have contact with. So there are other expectations of those who are working in quarantine, as well as all of the testing around those who work in quarantine. To date, everything around the management of this case is as we would expect. And we've picked it up through our testing regime. The close contacts and contacts of contacts have been tested. People who need to be are in isolation. It is exactly as we would expect.
Why not move the South Island to the north?
Yeah, I expect that will be a question that members of the public would have, and I think the point we need to make is that we do have interregional travel. We do have people coming into the South Island, and as I've explained, the modelling suggests there is still a 25% chance that there could be cases that emerge outside of Auckland. I want to make sure that we're keeping everyone in the South Island safe, because level 2 restrictions are a better way of managing outbreaks than having level 3 restrictions, because we didn't.
Is that 25%?
Just generally, no, across the country. I think if you split it down again, we'd probably see a reduction again in the likelihood for the South, but not zero. And so I think we do need to make sure we're still protecting the South Island while we are ensuring we've got good containment of this cluster.
If Australia refuses to come here for the first Murdoch Cup
Oh, look, I don't anticipate that being an issue. We're working through still some logistics, keeping in mind that for games between New Zealand and Australia, that is a different risk profile for teams from Australia than, for instance, the likes of South Africa and Argentina, where, for instance, we already had team members who had tested positive for COVID. So I do believe that we'll be able to find a workable solution so that we can make the Bledisloe Cup happen.
How would you feel about moving it to Australia instead?
I don't think that's going to be necessary. I do think we'll find a solution that works for both sides.
And will you be asking New Zealand Rugby to avoid holding a Bledisloe Cup test on election day?
No, I think that New Zealanders are perfectly able to engage in the Bledisloe Cup and an election. I'll be trying to do the same. So no, I won't ask that. I think the most important thing is that New Zealanders get that chance to see that match. It'll be up to the rugby unions to determine on what day they're held.
It is something that you traditionally try and avoid having an election the same day as the Black Sea, though, isn't it?
Yeah, but these are unusual times, and I'm pretty sure that we are able as a nation to accommodate both a rugby game and an election. And ultimately, I would rather see us enjoying rugby and a match with the Australians than say that we can't because of the election. I don't think that would be right.
You're not worried it would affect turnout?
No, I'm not. I mean, keeping in mind, of course, traditionally we'd be talking evening matches and, of course, polling closing in the evening. So, no, I'm not worried about turnout. And I also expect that we will see more early voting than we perhaps traditionally do. The Electoral Commission has planned for anywhere up to 60% of people voting early this election. And perhaps if they're also planning for a rugby game, we might see an even higher lift.
Well, can I just ask you, with the social or physical distancing on public transport
Yeah.
in New Zealand, is that pretty much effective immediately? And would you look at
Yes.
masks remaining mandatory even if we do move back to level 1?
And so masks remain key at the alert level we're at presently, and it will be implemented over the next 24 hours, so it can be as of taking effect as of now, but we do expect that public transport operators might need to take a little bit of time to change up the requirements mid-shift. In terms of what we expect at level 1, that's something Cabinet will give consideration to next Monday, but at the moment, given the settings we're at, we'll be maintaining, of course, mask use at level 2.
Will you make the Māori compulsory in schools?
We haven't done that to date, in part because actually, even if we wanted to, that wouldn't be something that we could physically achieve. We've spent the last period of time training over 1,200 educators to make sure they're in a position to be able to use Te Reo Māori in education more often, and that is part of the foundation work we need to do to make it possible for more of our young people to be exposed to the language.
Should we rename New Zealand Aotearoa?
I hear more and more often the use of Aotearoa interchangeably with New Zealand, and that is a positive thing. Whether or not we change it in law, I don't think materially changes the fact that New Zealanders do increasingly refer to Aotearoa, and I think that's a transition that is being welcomed.
Make it an official name, though.
Sorry?
You could make it official, though.
Yeah, it's not something that we've explored, but I am really encouraged to continue to see people use it more frequently, and I hope to see it used internationally more frequently as well.
With the change of physical distancing laws,
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
with the change of physical distancing laws
Yes.
on airplanes, will be any requirements for airlines and or airports to put extra restrictions in place to stop that potential super spreading you talked about earlier?
Yeah, so for what we really want to see maintained by our airlines is, of course, enforcement of mask use, because that has been a key part of the Director General's decision and advice that this can change. And this essentially has happened on his advice. But what we need to see is when we're loading passengers, making sure we're maintaining physical distancing for loading and disembarkation, because that's where you start to see a little bit more of the congestion. When you're all seated and you're all masked, that's one thing, but making sure that we're doing that safely is another. So that's something we'll continue to ask the airlines to help us with.
Jim Bolt asked for this move last week. Was his voice one of the ones you listened to in deciding to make this change?
Oh, look, I think it's fair to say we've always been aware of that. Yes, of course, we know that the view of both the airline and mayors has been that they saw this as being a constraint. At the same time, there are some who haven't wanted parts of the country moving around. We ultimately, as a Cabinet, constantly have to balance public health safety, and some of those calls, but this decision was made because our view is we can safely have people move around the country. Mask use has been taken up well, and so we feel confident making this change at this point.
How disappointed are you?
I'll pan around if I may, Jenna, and then come back to you.
On the rugby, where will the Wallabies be staying?
I haven't got those exact details, but I know when we were working through the SANZAR bid that we were looking at facilities that had good proximity to training. So I imagine that'll be the case again, but I'd need to come back to you with that detail.
Is the government playing a role in setting the dates for those tests? Presumably you need to be prepared for the players arriving.
Yeah, so we need to, essentially dates are put to us and we need to then accommodate those who are arriving within our managed isolation facilities. But ultimately those dates are being pursued by the rugby unions.
We've seen a few cases in botany. Is this potentially another subcluster? What do we know about those?
So that botany case was earlier in our cluster, and so that was, if I recall, it was at least over a week ago. And this particular case is from a family member who was already in isolation because they had other family members that had already been identified, and they were proactively tested as part of our ongoing testing before people are coming out of isolation. So not something we're concerned by, and already a known and identified part of the Auckland cluster.
Are you disappointed by the lack of progress in the rebuild of Dunedin Hospital?
Look, no. In fact, I think it is fair to say that this is going to be one of the largest infrastructure projects we'll see over the next period of time. It will likely be in excess of $1.4 billion and the largest hospital build in New Zealand. But we have just seen Cabinet has committed $127 million to start on demolition work, piling, to work with contractors early on in this process. So we continue to make progress on what will be a significant investment in this region.
But your promise was to start construction within your first term.
And again, we're now seeing on these sites the go-ahead and the funding for demolition work to start, and confirmation of the plan to have those two separate sites for inpatient and for day patients. Sequencing in that way means that we will be able to bring in the day patient element of the build early, and it means that we'll be able to see some of that access earlier than we otherwise might. So I'm pleased with the progress we're making.
National seems to be making a major play for the Tairi seat. Do you think that you will hold on to that seat?
Oh, we take nothing for granted ever. Any seat that you name, we will work very, very hard, and Ingrid Leary is. Yeah, I am, though, very, coming down here, believe that our investment will speak for itself. Whether or not it's Dunedin Hospital, whether or not it's the 20 plus million that's gone into making sure that we have a construction hub, that we are supporting trainees for what will be significant infrastructure build down here in this region. We're seeing a pipeline of work that will really invigorate Dunedin, and that is very exciting.
Was there any thought given to locking down Auckland and eliminating the risk of regional travel and moving the rest of the country going to
Yeah, in the early days that was something that we as a cabinet discussed. But of course you'll recall we did have a regional boundary at level 3. Maintaining that regional boundary with level 2 restrictions posed many, many challenges. So the view was better to be able to ensure that regional travel of people who are both wanting to go into Auckland and out of Auckland, but keep everyone safe in the meantime with those level 2 restrictions.
Is that fair to the rest of the country?
There are, keep in mind, you can see from some of the economic data I've set out today that we have seen a lift in economic activity, and that includes in the rest of the country who have had level 2 restrictions. That may not have been the case if we hadn't had that interregional travel. So we are having to balance both those issues, and there are plenty of people outside of Auckland who have had need to go into it as well.
You'll be travelling around the country quite a bit. Will you feel comfortable sitting so close to someone on a plane after so long having that physical distancing?
Well, mostly the people I sit next to are security detail on planes, but what I want to assure people is that we've made this decision because the health advice is that mask use and keeping distancing as we load and offload planes is sufficient to keep people safe, and we wouldn't be making that decision had we not received that advice.
Were you concerned by the growing number
Yeah.
of people against the government's restrictions, particularly in Auckland?
Yeah, I've never been of the view that we would have 100% of people who will necessarily agree with the restrictions that are in place. But what we need to make sure is we're encouraging and ensuring enforcement with as many people as possible, because we're reliant on the entire team of 5 million complying in order to keep us safe. So it doesn't surprise me, but however, it's really important that we have as many people as possible complying.
In terms of people complying, Winston said in the statement that he's just travelled around South Island. He says people here are not observing social distancing because there's no real threat of COVID-19. What do you make of that?
Oh, well, look, he's obviously entitled to his view, and I am aware that we are making all of these decisions during an election period. And so actually New Zealand First all the way through have from time to time taken a different position on lifting restrictions, tending to want to ease them earlier than the majority of us have. That hasn't changed, but you might hear a bit more vocalising of that during a campaign. Okay, thanks everyone.